Okay, Myshele is a writer, activist, graphic designer, as I can vouch for, because she's done some excellent graphics for us, and a former academic. She's asked me to say she's originally from Trumpland, but she's lived in Scotland for 13 years now, and Aberdeen for 5. She's currently the co-convener of the Scottish Green Party in Aberdeen and Shire, and she's heavily involved with the Radical Independence campaign, both locally and nationally. And her day job is helping fellow immigrants with employability issues.
Thanks, Fiona.
Okay, Myshele?
Hello, everybody. So I'm going to speak, it's a little bit different than what you've heard so far, but hopefully complimentary. I don't have a presentation either. I've been asked to talk about the political angle of diversification. So I'm going to cover the stuff that you're expecting about governments, about parties, about the Scottish independence debate. But I think what we need to be talking about is much broader and much more fundamental. So I'm going to try to get back to first principles and set our local and national issues in a wider context. So I'm a sociologist by trade, and we like to talk about understanding biography and history within social structures. C. Wright Mills came up with that phrase in the 1950s, and it still rings true today. So each of us makes choices in our individual lives. We move through life, but our choices are constrained by the circumstances that we find ourselves in. So each of us has personal troubles in our lives, but when lots of people have the same troubles, it's a public issue. And you can only really understand public issues when you look at the wider social context. So here in Aberdeen, one person losing their job is a personal trouble. But when thousands of people lose their jobs, it's a public issue. In this case, we know the reason. The oil price collapsed and the bosses decided to slow down operations. Most of the people affected had no say in this decision, even though it's thrown their lives into chaos and the lives of their communities into chaos. So that brings us to the question of politics. So ultimately, when we talk about politics, we're talking about power. We're talking about the ability to make decisions that affect people's lives, or the ability to bend the rules to do things that are usually out of bounds, like avoiding tax or killing civilians. When most people hear the word politics, they think of mainstream representative democracy, posh white men in suits making decisions, having bickering with each other somewhere far away. Nothing to do with me. Yes, the strings are pulled by politicians, but also by giant corporations, by banks, by media firms. It's about elections, it's about laws, and the sorts of things you hear about on the nightly news, but the political dimension of power runs through every part of our lives. Our air and water are clean or not, based on political decisions. The way that food is produced and distributed, our health, our jobs, our clothing, our transport, these are all influenced by what has come before and by what's happening now. Biography and history within social structures. Often we only notice the political dimension when there's conflict, when there's crisis, when personal troubles become public issues. So food has recently become political because thousands of people can't afford to eat. The NHS becomes political when the junior doctors are forced to go on strike. Immigration becomes political when families are torn apart by visa restrictions. So whether we agree with these political structures or not, they affect our lives. So in the context of diversification, the power to decide energy policy rests with Westminster. I was looking up a little bit of information about this, and investment in renewables will decrease 95% between 2016 and 2020. And that's just based on what they were already planning to invest. So they've cut what they were planning by 95%. Meanwhile, Westminster has increased tax breaks and other subsidies to the oil and gas industry. We're the only G7 country that is doing that. And in 2009, they pledged to phase out fossil fuel subsidies. So they're doing a good job of it by increasing it. But here in the Northeast, mainstream politicians are still shouting for more investment in oil and gas. Many of them accept that we need to cut our emissions, cut our carbon, and move to renewable energy. But they're faced with this situation where they've got short-term pressures of job losses and angry constituents, and it seems like the most creative solution they can think of is to beg for more money for a dying industry. So some people in this room will say that we can't build a strong renewables industry without standing on the broad shoulders of the UK. Some will say that we can't do it without breaking free from Westminster. I would say that both of these arguments are flawed, and it comes down to power. In my view, we cannot wean ourselves off fossil fuels while decisions about energy are made at Westminster, regardless of what party is in power, regardless of who's in charge. For the last 40 years, the UK government has been committed to growth at any cost, economic growth at any cost, not growth in any other positive thing. It's also deeply tied up with the finance industry, who are lobbying to suck every last bit of profit out of the North Sea And as an earlier speaker talked about, they're trying to put off the cost of decommissioning forever and ever. The Scottish renewables industry is a direct threat to some very powerful interests, and they'll do everything they can to block and postpone our progress. But Scottish independence does not guarantee a magical fossil-free future. The same powerful interests at work in Westminster, they don't stop when they hit the border. Whether we're looking at politicians who beg for more oil subsidies or the ones who abstain from the vote to ban fracking, it's clear that we'll have our work cut out for us, even post-independence, so we have to keep pushing. But I do think that independence is an important first step because it gives us something like a fresh start with space for other voices and other priorities out of the status quo. Because domination and coercion are not the only kinds of power. There's also the power to influence, to inspire, to shift the terms of the debate and open up new possibilities. And that is the role of both movement politics and left-wing political parties. We might not be big players, but we've been able to make some difference by dragging the debate to the left, sometimes kicking and screaming. But even that is not enough. We're not going to solve the climate crisis by tinkering around at the edges and trying to find solutions and space for social change inside the existing structures. Because we live in a system that judges politicians' success by how well they manage the economy, which translates to short-term GDP growth. This is the ideology of a cancer cell, growth, 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 until the host dies. We live in a system that wants to apply the logic of markets to every aspect of our lives and let every decision be driven by self-interest. We live in a system that's sacrificing our ecosystems, our communities, our health, and our lives on the altar of short-term profit. It's ridiculous. So capitalism is the problem. Anybody who knows me will not be surprised to hear me say that. Even if we shift to 100% renewable energy tomorrow, if we leave the oil in the ground, if we stop making nuclear weapons, staying within the confines of capitalism, there will be some new crisis emerging, because that is the nature of capitalism. Exploitation is in its DNA. It is incapable of ignoring an opportunity for profit. So my dog rolled in shit last week. It's annoying, but I can't get angry with her. She's a dog. It's in her nature. When she finds some fox poo in the woods, she has an urge to roll in it. I can't expect her to ignore that urge on her own, but I can clean up the mess afterwards, and I can try to intervene to prevent her from, indulging in that particular urge. So now when I see her approaching some shit, I call her back to me, and I put her on the lead, and she'll whine, and she'll pull at it, but ultimately I have the authority to prevent her from rolling in shit. So I see this as the only legitimate purpose for the state. Capitalism exists to make profit by exploiting people and ecosystems. Until we come up with something better, which I'd like to have, the state needs to intervene and enforce some limits. Sustainable capitalism is a myth. It's like expecting my dog to stroll by a pile of fox poo without wanting to roll in it. So we've all heard of Adam Smith's invisible hand. Less well known is his call for prudent regulation by the state. He was talking about this stuff in the 1700s. He could see that capitalism cannot control itself, and he recognized the need for a democratic force to keep it in check. In the context of what we're talking about here, that means subsidizing renewables, limiting the fossil fuel industry, and ending the arms trade. It's a tall order. And it's unlikely, it's possible, but it's unlikely that corporate executives will have a sudden change of heart and start making better choices. An earlier speaker talked about how the state can control the decline in the oil industry, but I don't think they're going to do that on their own. It's unlikely that mainstream political parties are suddenly going to abandon their big donors and pursue an agenda of real sustainability and radical social change. It's very risky for them, and their mainstream political parties are fairly risk-averse. So what do we do? Some people in here might be interested in lifestyle-based solutions to climate change. Of course, we all need to recycle and eat less meat and ride bicycles. But individual consumer choices make almost no difference to the wider systems that are running the show. The idea of personal troubles and public issues applies here. One person putting solar panels on their homes, that's great. But when all new build homes are required to have solar panels, that becomes a public issue, and that's a really positive public issue, and that has much more influence on what's happening than that one person putting solar panels on their house, even though it's a positive thing. So focusing on individual choices is not a good strategy for systemic change, and it can even be counterproductive. The best way to lose support is to make people feel guilty about their choices. So we need collective action to solve the problems that we face. Some people want to change mainstream parties from within, and that's a legitimate choice. I'm not sure how effective it can be, and it's not a choice that I want to make, but that is a positive thing that some people are doing. But for me, the most important tools that we have are mass movements, alternative political parties, pressure groups, real grassroots groups, including grassroots energy groups. We can't call the shots, but we can build momentum and keep growing and apply pressure. We can keep important issues on the agenda, and we can keep calling for radical change. We can connect in solidarity with others around the world, and we can find global solutions to global problems. For a long time, I resisted joining a political party. I've always been an activist, not a politician. I don't want to promote a hierarchical political system. But I've come to realize that political parties have a certain kind of legitimacy, and that's a tool that I'm willing to use to open up things on a wider stage. It's not a tool for everyone, but I would argue that it's an important tool, and everyone who wants social change needs to engage in some kind of collective action. Individual choices are not enough. So at the moment, mainstream parties and corporate leaders want everyone to accept capitalism's mess and clean up after it. Not just the ecological mess, but the social mess too. Inequality, poverty, alcohol and drug abuse, ill health, despair. It's a mess that can't be washed away in the bathtub. But I would argue that we can provide the harness and the lead to start to bring capitalism under control, at least until we transition to something better.